Forgiveness is Not Buddhist. This is the title of an essay written back in 2017 by Ken McLeod in Tricycle magazine. It's an interesting question for us to consider when thinking about Buddhist practice. Because when we think about Buddhist practice, we think about practices aimed towards increasing wisdom and kindness and calm. And isn't forgiveness, after all, part of kindness practice? Now, part of what Ken McLeod wants to say is that the way we understand forgiveness now depends upon really a Christian background, a Christian understanding of what forgiveness really means. And forgiveness plays a central role, of course, in Christian spirituality. Christianity arose out of Jewish traditions earlier that saw the relationship between God and humans as essentially a contractual obligation. That there was a kind of a covenant between God and humans, that as long as humans lived up to the rules that God had sent or had set out, that God would be good to us. Part of what was particularly original in Christianity was this idea of original sin. That is to say, back in this early days of the Garden of Eden, that, Adam and Eve basically did something bad in the garden. This caused all of humanity to have this original sin in all of us, and that sin was forgiven. Here we get to forgiveness, forgiven by Jesus' actions by being crucified. That's the idea within Christianity that makes forgiveness so central to Christian spirituality. Now, to be honest, none of this makes a lot of sense to me, but then I was not raised in these traditions. The question for us today is what forgiveness has to do with Buddhism, however. Now, for Ken McLeod, forgiveness comes up in essentially a contractual relation. The idea being that if I wrong somebody, that I therefore basically have a debt to them. I've incurred a debt to them. And that they can release me from this debt by forgiving the debt. And their forgiveness, therefore, releases me from having done wrong to them. But as Ken McLeod notes, Buddhist karma doesn't work that way. Buddhist karma is something that is inherent to each individual, each person. There's no way that one person can erase the karma of another. The only way to erase bad karma, well, there are essentially two traditional ways to erase or lessen bad karma in Buddhism. One is to have the bad karma come to fruition in some kind of painful experience or occurrence to you, and having undergone then that painful occurrence, that karma is then, the fruition of that karma has happened, that karma is now exhausted. The other way for you to get out from under bad karma in Buddhism, at least traditionally, is to perform a lot of good karma. The Buddha gives an analogy here. He says, a teaspoon of salt in a glass of water is going to make the water nearly undrinkable. However, a teaspoon of salt in the Ganges River, you can hardly even notice. In fact, you really can't notice it. The idea being that if you have a little bit of, or a spoonful of bad karma in a little bit of good karma, it's going to create a huge effect. But if you have a spoonful of bad karma in a lot of good karma, a Ganges River of good karma, that bad karma, even though it may have an effect, it's going to have a much smaller effect. The other aspect that Ken McLeod sees as somewhat suspect in this idea of forgiveness is that it seems to set up a kind of an egoistic power dynamic between people. That the person who does the forgiving is in a position of real power with respect to the person that they are forgiving. They have control over the other person's karma, for example, in how they act. As McLeod says, the self-interest implicit in this exercise of power reinforces attachment to a sense of self. As taught by some Western Theravada teachers, this self-interest is made quite explicit. People are encouraged to practice forgiveness to make themselves feel better. For me, at least, such interpretations go against the basic tenets of Buddhist practice. I think we would have to agree with Ken McLeod that it's not very Buddhist to suggest that we undertake practices of sort of self-interested power in order to make ourselves feel better. So then do we have to say that forgiveness just is bad practice? Is it irredeemably egotistical and transactional in this sense, involving this idea of contracts between people? Well, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, who in fact is a Western Theravada teacher in the mold perhaps that Ken McLeod is talking about in that quote I just read, he argues that forgiveness practice is good. And he does so in a follow-up article in a later issue of Tricycle magazine. I'll leave links to both of the articles down below in the notes, although I think they may be paywalled, I'm not exactly sure. In any event, Thanissaro agrees with Ken McLeod that one person cannot erase the karma of another, so in that sense, forgiveness practice is not about a contract between two people that's been somehow violated and that debts can be forgiven in that way. That Thanissaro agrees about that. But Thanissaro doesn't think that's the point of forgiveness practice. Forgiveness practice is not about absolving somebody of past bad karma. For Thanissaro, forgiveness practice is all about cutting off the root of the bad karma we're likely to incur upon ourselves in the future. That's the whole point of forgiveness. As he says, forgiveness may not be able to undo old bad karma, but it can prevent new bad karma from being done. This is especially true with the bad karma that in Pali is called vera. Vera is often translated as hostility, animosity, or antagonism, but it is a particular instance of these attitudes, the vengeful animosity that wants to get back at someone for perceived wrongs. This attitude is what has no place in Buddhist practice. Forgiveness is what clears it out of the way. And in support of this argument, of this claim, Thanissaro points to some very famous stanzas from the Dhammapada. They abused me, they hit me, they beat me, they robbed me. For those who bear such a grudge, hatred is never laid to rest. They abused me, they hit me, they beat me, they robbed me. For those who bear no such grudge, hatred is laid to rest. For never is hatred laid to rest by hate, it's laid to rest by non-hate. This is an ancient teaching. Looked at in this way, forgiveness is not about egoism, and certainly not about exercising power over somebody else's past bad karma. Instead, it's all about the future. It's about the wise understanding that even if society might condone my retribution, I'm going to forego that retribution in favor of breaking the cycle of violence between people, animosity between people. That is, as the Dhammapada says, hatred does not end through hate, it only ends through non-hate. Now, some people will translate this that hatred ends through love, and while that is certainly true, I don't think that's an accurate translation of the term, which literally means, the term in Pali is literally non-hate. And that, I think, more captures the basic point here, which is we don't need to love our tormentor, let's say, but at least we have to stop exercising hatred towards them. And that in that stopping of the hatred, in that stopping of the exercising maliciousness towards them, we are at least potentially going to break that chain of violence. Now, none of this is to say that these practices are easy. And in some situations, for many of us, these practices may not even seem possible. That's fine. But the question, at least for now, for this video, is whether these practices of forgiveness are Buddhist in any kind of sense. And I think the upshot here is that it depends how we understand forgiveness. If forgiveness is understood contractually as forgiving the debts of another person, forgiving the bad karma of another person in a kind of an egoistic power grab way, then, as Ken McLeod argues, that kind of practice is not Buddhist. On the other hand, if we understand forgiveness as a method of cutting off the cycle of retribution into the future and releasing my necessity to get back at somebody for having harmed me, if forgiveness is understood as giving up this kind of vengeful animosity in Thanissaro's terms, then indeed this kind of practice is essentially Buddhist, as part of kindness practice. Now, if you would like to learn more about the ideas of karma in Buddhism and early Buddhism, I have a playlist that I'll leave up here on the screen for you to take a look at. If you're getting something out of these videos that I'm putting up every week, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.